All right, y'all. I think we can get started now, and as folks trickle in, we can get going. Good afternoon, happy Friday. My name is Kafili Thomas. I am the Director of Program Partnerships here at Progressive Multiplier Fund. Really excited to give this training today, covering um, a recap of the whirlwind that was 2023 and doing some 2024 predictions. This is something that we have done kind of in a series since we've been doing these Fundraising Friday trainings. So I'll be responding to what my colleague Polly had thought through as the trends that would potentially emerge in 2023, see how close to right we were on that, as well as provide some outlooks for 2024. So this is the Progressive Multiplier team. Um, we have grown probably since the last time you saw us on a Fundraising Friday call. But again, Kavili Thomas, he, him pronouns. And I will explain a little bit more about what Progressive Multiplier is and what we do. So our goal is to help organizations build a progressive movement of, by, and for everyday people. And we do this by organizing and leveraging funding to create on-ramps for progressive organizations to start, strengthen, or scale individual giving and earn revenue programs. Through both an online community of practice and our grant making and support program, we will build the progressive sector's revenue generation skills, knowledge and skills so that it can amplify a people-powered movement. So in addition to these trainings that we do, the technical assistance that we offer, we also make grants as well for funding revenue generation projects. They fall in three primary buckets of work. So achieving justice, realizing democracy, and restoring the environment. And our goal with this work is to grow the revenue generation capacity of groups that spend most of their resources doing work that adds up to large scale change through either government, industry, or legal decisions from the court system. Um, and what this work often looks like, or running campaigns, organizing, litigating, or doing civic engagement and public education and mobilization to influence decision makers. And we believe by investing in these organizations, orgs like yours, that are on the cutting edge of doing real base building work, um, that is the most efficient path to building sustained power. Right. So shout out and thank you to our amazing partners over at Resilience Initiative. Uh, for folks who haven't done so yet, um, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your org, and your role. Um, as always, this session will be recorded and it will be on the private YouTube channel. The bit.ly link is right down below, and I will share it again at the end of the presentation. So in addition to these Fundraising Friday trainings, we'll be announcing what the new format is, or I think that announcement actually should have went out very recently. Um, but there is going to be additionally some fundraising coaching that is available. So that's up to 5 hours of individual coaching throughout the year that you can tap into and access with myself or some of my other colleagues here at Progressive Multiplier Fund. We've helped groups on a number of different projects, including those that you see listed here, board trainings, development plan presentations, end of year campaigns, anything like that. Now is a great time to, if you have a fundraising plan for the year and you want a second pair of eyes on it, you want some insights or even some prospecting on how you've set your systems up. If there are some things you should be looking out for, including, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email Michelle Mengel directly at michelle@resilience.org to get all set up. And again, all of our sessions from Fundraising Friday are on the YouTube channel. So bit.ly/fundraising dash Friday. Feel free to share this one if you find it super relevant, or go back in the archives and see other things that we've trained on. And you can share it with friends, colleagues, coworkers, or use it for your own edification. Great. So we are, as I said, going to do first a recap of 2023. Some of the topics that we will cover are inflation rising, and giving falling as a prediction, predictions around organizational capacity and burnout, and also predictions around funder fatigue. And from there, we will go to 2024 predictions. We will cover trust deterioration and funder paralysis, um, the brewing storm that is the national election that is coming this November, AI and fundraising, uh, as well as digital giving trends and revenue diversification. Right. So let us start with the recap. Um, so the first prediction that we had, or that Polly, my colleague, had last year, this time last year, was that giving would continue to fall as inflation affected people's ability to give. So we saw coming out of the pandemic, a sharp rise in giving in 2020 into about halfway through 2021, and a really precipitous drop off to pre-pandemic levels, and now slightly below pre-pandemic levels, which is very unusual for giving. Um, Overall, we saw a 10% drop in donors on Giving Tuesday in and of itself. So slightly more dollars were raised, but the actual amount of donors dropped precipitously. And the Chronicle of Philanthropy surveyed over 1,000 fundraisers and felt that there was notable apprehension around how we deal with inflation, staffing issues, and just general worries around the economy. Um, as a actual, you know, economic fact, inflation started slowing down in July of 2022 and continued to fall through November of 2023. But I think what is a common misconception about inflation is it's literally just the rate of price increases, not whether prices are going to decrease or things of that nature. So these sharp levels of price increases have slowed down, but we still did see price increases, and sometimes that leads into the sentiment that the economy isn't doing much better. So we've seen in coming out of the pandemic sharp rises in various goods, but especially like necessities, food, clothing, things of that nature. The prices of those really rise sharply during a short amount of time. And so the falling inflation rate means that they're not rising as sharp, not that the prices are actually dropping back down again. Um, and so a lot of this relates to the numbers are looking better from an economic standpoint, but from a social standpoint, people are still struggling and to keep up with the cost of living increases. And it regardless of what the economic factors look like on paper, there is a collective trauma that Americans are dealing with when it comes to how the economy is doing, and that directly affects what they believe their capacity to give is. Wanted to see from you all, have you seen this in your work? How has individual giving been on your teams? Have you been able to keep up with your goals, or have you seen some shifts in the data now that you've had some time to look back on 2023? Okay, Mara said, we've been able to keep up with goals. Eliane, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, said that they've seen a drop. Raven, also a decline in individual donors. Laura as well. Um, Eliane, Raven, Laura, would y'all like to talk about what that has looked like for your organization? Are there like specific segments where there has been a drop off, or has it been like kind of across the board? Major donors, grassroots donors, mid-major donors, all of them kind of having a drop. And feel free to come off mute and talk. It's always nice to hear other voices. So feel free to do that, or if you don't feel comfortable, you can also use the chat.
I can share, and good to see some, I think, Minnesota comrades on this call. You got my name right, Eliane Farhat, she, her pronouns. I am the executive director at Take Action Minnesota. Yeah, it's a sort of like, it's a weird, I mean, we're like always on the project of getting our individual giving donor or structures tighter and clearer. But one place where we're seeing a massive drop is like we got connected to some sort of emergent, grassrootsy, national sort of configurations of individuals giving. And that's just like totally fallen off. And they got very activated, yeah, post 2020. I mean, they were very activated to like build in places where they could have an impact on our like what's nationally possible politically, make sure our president supports our values, although big question on that front, all enduringly in this moment and ongoing. Anyway, so folks like not living in Minnesota who's had an interest in investing in Minnesota has really dropped off. And like we're seeing some I mean, but it's also like we're also finding like if we ask people and we like have a program, they'll give a sort of lower levels, grassroots donors. We see some folks like emerging, giving more. So it's not hopeless, but we're like in a moment of transition and where we were banking on some individual gifts. They're not coming through at the level they were before.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for sharing. That's a very common thing that we've seen over the past year. It really has tended to be a mixed bag and org by org. Like there might be some areas that might be performing slightly well, but overall, like it's that the individual giving has dropped for a number of reasons. So and we'll go into some of those in depth, especially like kind of the political situation that we're in now. So for folks who do policy work, who do voter registration, things of that nature. This also, I think, has a very strong direct correlation to that work, a little bit more than maybe other nonprofits and organizations that are working in tangential focus areas. So we'll dive a little bit deeper on that. But thank you for sharing. Um, Raven or Laura, do you want to share? And also thank you, Emma and Catherine. I see your notes in here. You're also welcome to share a little bit more about what you all are seeing. Especially Catherine, because you said you've seen an increase, right? So maybe also hearing about what your org does, and I know you're talking about the situation in Gaza really affecting your work. So it may be interesting to hear how that's affected increased fundraising.
Yeah, thanks, Kafili. I can come in quickly. Um, yeah, I wrote this in the chat, but I think this was definitely an anomaly of a year for our organization. I work for Action Aid USA, and it's part of a larger federation. And we're a humanitarian response organization. And so we're actually we're facing challenges in institutional funding, which is has normally been our strong stream. And we've seen a an increase in both individual giving, and actually our major gifts program increased, I think, 200% this year, which was like, yeah, pretty wild. It's so yeah, we've seen an increase in both individual donors and but again, they're one-off gifts, right? So this isn't something that's really sustainable. A lot of it's for our biggest challenge is really converting those folks who give to us in response to an emergency and then bringing them along to really help with donate unrestricted funds so that we can do more of our like rooted advocacy policy work.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's also sort of a mixed feeling, right? Because yeah, it's not really, it's something that's great for the organization, but it's also weird to celebrate this increase because it's at the expense of like yeah, a lot of pain and suffering. So yeah, that's just what a picture, what's been going on for us.
100%. Thank you for sharing. And I know that that's a very complicated and complex situation to be in as a fundraiser. Um, I think that where your organization may want to focus some effort and thought processes for this year would be maybe developing some form of a welcome series. We've done that, trainings on that in previous fundraising Fridays. So I would definitely suggest going into the YouTube channel and checking that out. That way you can figure out ways of like keeping folks engaged around, the activism and the mobilization that's really happening with individuals right now. I think that the split that you're talking about institutional funding shift and individual funding shift is pretty common around amount organizations that are doing direct aid right now. And I think that there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I would suggest definitely thinking through what a welcome series could look like for your org. And then also thinking of different ways to engage and mobilize folks who have donated in the past in different ways outside of just financially, right? So if there is a, apprehension, I guess I would say, against like fundraising against a tragedy, which is totally understandable. There are different ways for folks to get involved. So like the welcome series could be about maybe political education around the issue or advocacy and being able to share information with colleagues, with friends, things of that nature that keep people plugged in and will hopefully eventually keep them activated to your organization to give another gift maybe later on in the year, but that it doesn't feel so icky, you know. So that's something that I would suggest in that situation. Hopefully that's helpful. Great. Good. So it unfortunately sounds like this is tracking for a lot of folks outside of some very unique scenarios. So let's talk about some other ones. So another prediction that Polly made was that nonprofits will struggle with employee burnout and struggle to replace staff. Uh, some of the results of things that we found is that 45% of nonprofit employees are actually planning to leave their organizations in the next 2 years. McKinsey did a study with Australian nonprofits last year and asked folks to self-identify across a number of working zones. So there was like a blue zone where it's like you're kind of coasting at work. Um, you're underworking essentially and not really being stimulated. There's the green zone, which is the optimal space where you feel really engaged, love your job, everything's going good. The orange space where it's like I'm starting to feel a little bit overloaded. Would love some more help, whether that's sharing the workload capacity, etc., or more pay, things like that. And then there's the red zone, which is like I'm burnt out and like I'm actively like trying to figure out how to end this working relationship. And 88% of respondents self-identified in the orange and red zones, which is, I don't think you could wave a bigger a bigger red flag of the state of our industry right now, and how people are engaging with the work than that. 47% of employees overall in the nonprofit sector are dissatisfied with their pay ranges. And then also at the executive level, at the leadership level, turnover rate for nonprofit EDs is around 18 to 22% annually. So a fifth of all organizations are losing their head and their leader every year. That is a really, really high level of turnover. And we know ED searches are incredibly nuanced and difficult to execute. So on average, it's taking orgs 7 to 10 months to recruit a new ED. So basically, if you lose your ED after Q1, you're not really going to get a new ED on average until the next year, which is also really scary for a lot of organizations. And we're seeing the repercussions of that. On the burnout situation, I think it's also important to recognize where we are as a society, because whilst a lot of different spaces like shut down during the pandemic, our industry was really primary caregivers stepping in a lot of spaces. So we've actually seen demand for our work and our services in many areas increase, and that demand has not stopped. Because of the inflation issues that we talked about before, cost of living issues, or just political societal work, depending on where your organization sits and what work you do. But I think that there's a real opportunity to uplift that, like, our industry hasn't had a break or like a real reckoning with what has happened over the last 3 4 years, and a lot of folks are feeling burnt out by that. And then also, maybe the promise of things that were supposed to happen, whether you look at it from a political standpoint with the shift in administration, or you look at it from a social standpoint with the uprising for Black Lives in 2020. Like, we've gone through a lot of political and social upheaval in the past few years. And for folks, maybe the gains that we've seen um, in response to that upheaval haven't been so clear cut. And so we're seeing a lot of folks who are feeling a little bit lost in their work, burnt out, or even leaving the sector. Because as we know, there is the private sector and that pays more, and the government sector sometimes has better benefits. So it's hard to keep talent, especially in the face of all of this burnout. Um, you know, uh, I don't want people to feel like they have to divulge their own personal situations, but has your organization seen a lot of turnover with staff? Has it been hard to find quality staff as you're trying to grow and expand and do your work?
This is Raven with Avow in Texas. I can say that I'm new in my role. I started in January. I'm the executive director of the organization, and we were without an executive director for a year. So I'm coming in and seeing that staff who really held the organization very well are burnt out and ready to leave. So we're going to have a large amount of turnover after a year without a permanent ED.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Raven. That's a difficult situation to walk into, and unfortunately, a situation that a lot of orgs are facing right now too. In the absence of executive director leadership, also board leadership as well in a lot of these situations. Um, you know, Other folks have had to step up and step into different roles, and that, sometimes is not compensated fully or in ways that are, really rewarding for staff. But, at that, when you reach the end of that process, and like, I'm sure they're lucky and very excited to have you, Raven, but like, folks are burnt out from having to do all that extra work and holding that for an entire year. So it's a difficult place for folks to be in. Laura says that you didn't have a development director for nearly 2 years. Can you talk about that, Laura? I feel like that's I'm very glad that y'all are still around because that's a that's a hard thing to navigate.
Hey, so I just realized that my name on here is Laura Derrick. That is not my name. My name's Orshi. It's fine. I don't know how that happened, but Laura Derrick is our new development director.
Gotcha.
So yeah, so our development director left in like 2022. And then our managing director kind of stepped in temporarily, but he too burned out and left last year. And so yeah, we've been struggling quite a bit. And then we finally hired a development director in October. And she's been really great. She's like a very seasoned person. And I feel like people like her are hard to come across. Um, so yeah, I feel like we're lucky. It was luck that we got a development director, but operating without one for almost 2 years was pretty destabilizing. So I'd say that also kind of played into why our funding was also lower.
Percent. Thank you for sharing. That can be super difficult, and I think that that also speaks to sometimes that the pipeline in nonprofits is kind of jammed up a little bit, and so now that we're in a situation that we're looking for a ton of development directors or program directors or EDs, a lot of folks haven't gotten the shot to like move up into the ladder to be what folks would deem like automatically qualified for that role, right? So I think that we have a little bit of a talent gap in the sense of people's resumes may not really reflect their ability to do that work. So it's making it a little bit harder to find folks. Maura, your staff is growing. Would love to hear about that. And if that's for a specific reason or to ramp up for something.
Yeah, so I'm actually one of the new staff people, because our previous fundraising director went into grad school. So I came to replace them, and we hired another person for admin. I think we are trying to really fill out all the areas of the organization, because right now, for example, we don't have a comms person. So I think we have been able to afford this because of also institutional grants, but at the same time, we're trying to really like draw out a specific individual donor program, because we had a really good base, but the fact is that our base is made up of older people who are not able to give as much anymore. And so we're trying to we're trying to get like a new audience.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing, Mara. We'll talk a little bit more about how folks are trying to engage with younger donor bases. So I think that that might be something that would be potentially helpful for you. And then definitely refer back to previous trainings as well, because I know that we've done a lot of stuff that I think would be supportive for your work. I'm interested in your chrysalis year, Sheila. If you could talk a little bit about that and maybe how you're also talking to funders and the public about taking like kind of a pause year, because I think that that's a very unique and unusual tactic, but would love to hear a little bit more about that. I think that would be very useful for folks to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I'm Sheila, use she, her pronouns. I'm from Interrupting Criminalization. And what we're doing this year is a chrysalis year. So our directors, Andrea and Mariam, planned this out. Actually, they saw it coming after 2020 when they were working every day, all night, and knew that burnout would be coming down the pipeline. And so we've been planning for it in both fundraising and in our workflow. And what we're doing is ramping down the work this year. So last year, I think we held like 200 events and trainings. And now we're scaling down to just kind of one-to-one support for groups, offering advising, and just taking a slower year for staff too, to be able to recover and explore new projects that people are interested in, do research, kind of get out of that cycle of just reacting. And it is a challenge for fundraising, right? Because a lot of funders, especially funders who do annual grant cycles, are like, well, what are you doing this year? And we're still doing quite a bit. And also, what we're launching next week is a curriculum that is meant for organizers to go through our past 5 years of resources we've produced, to kind of highlight what's out there. But yeah, I would love to hear ideas from anyone about how to pitch this to funders, to invest in the long-term sustainability of the work, even if the like output figures of this year are going to be smaller.
Yeah, for sure. That is very difficult. I can give a little bit of advice and definitely would open up the floor for other folks as well. I was at an organization that did kind of something similar out in like 2020. I was the associate director of development for a youth environmental organization, and post-election did kind of restructuring of the org. People were really burnt out after the ramp up to the election and everything like that. So I think what was really helpful was framing it as a strategic redesign. So kind of putting it in language that institutional funders understand, and that they're familiar with, because they do that all the time. We'll actually talk about that a little bit later. But being able to explain to them, like, we're gonna come out of this with very specific things. So like a strategic plan, a 3 to 5 year vision, certain like tangible things that will that you can like actualize and then roll out, and act up upon on subsequent years, was the way that we framed it, and really like started doing that pilot of testing that language with some of our like longest lasting funders, because we just had a built up affinity and trust there. And then once we saw some success with that, we're able to kind of parlay that to some of the other funders. There was a drop, but we're still able to like make budget for that year. So hopefully that's helpful, but would love to hear from other folks who have done something like that in the past or are maybe thinking about that now that you hear it.
Hi, my name's Anamika. I'm a small business majority. My pronouns are she, her. We haven't taken a chrysalis year, but I love that idea. But it made me think of one of our foundation funders, who we had a long track record with, who had funded us on a number of policy issues that we were working on. We were able to, in our ongoing conversations with them, make the case that they were funding us frequently to react to things. Like you were saying, you're trying to get out of the cycle of just reacting. And we were able to make the case that we wanted to do that too. And they gave us essentially a multi-year grant to build our capacity to respond to advocacy issues in a certain area as they arose. So it was a little tricky to write that grant, because we were like, what are we going to do? I don't know. Like, I don't know what the outputs are actually going to be. But what we've been reporting on are kind of engagement with our network in certain states that they care about, and at the federal level, engagement with policymakers, discussions that we've had, research that we've done that supports the policy issues that are important to us and to the funder. And so, yeah, we have been able to frame it in that way. But again, like you were saying, it was with a funder that already trusted us, that that we had a good relationship with, and we were able to argue that that they could get a lot more out of their money, essentially, if we were prepared to jump into these fights wherever they arose, rather than being like, oh my gosh, this is coming up in Colorado, we have to get ready for this. We would already be ready to respond, and so we were able to convince them that that was a good idea.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. That's super helpful. Great, so let's keep looking at some more of the recap. Donor fatigue was one. So the prediction was that individual giving would continue to shift as donor fatigue set in post-pandemic. Talked a little bit about this in the first one, but the results were that pretty much held up. Um, so Giving Tuesday donations went up by 0.6%, so not that much, but the number of donors dropped by 10%. Um, the drop in overall giving is only the fifth time in the last 40 years that giving has dropped. It's a very unusual time to be fundraising. So 2022 was one of the only other times as well. So having it happen in back-to-back years is also very unusual. Donors who contributed over $5,000 traditionally donated nearly 10% less last year. So if you've had major donors who were trying to figure things out, or maybe had a little bit more questions on, um, what, where they're going to be spending their money, and donating, that you're not alone in that. That was a very common thing. And donor retention fell by almost 20%. Same thing with new donors. New donor rate fell by almost 20%, and new donors gave around 34% less per person. So, difficult time to be fundraising on the individual side or the institutional side. Um, I want to uplift Raven's point because I think that going back to the burnout conversation, this is like a really great idea of using these weeks of rest to recover from sprints. So can you talk about a little bit about that, Raven? Because I think that if I understand correctly what y'all are trying to do, I think that that's brilliant, and more organizations should try and adopt this type of model and working it into their programming.
Yes, definitely. So I'm coming into an organization that's already pretty burnt out, and we work on the issue. Our primary issue is abortion in the state of Texas, and so you can imagine what we have been up against and will be up against in the future. So we're kind of shifting to convene strategy tables throughout the year, as our legislative season is next year, 2025. So for the remainder of 2024, we'll be doing strategic sprints at each of our strategic tables. In between those sprints, like those sprints are typically like 2.5 weeks where we are really engaging in research, prioritizing, understanding our tactics, evaluating, what strategic objectives have worked and what have not. And then after about 2.5 weeks, sometimes we push for 3, we will be going for a week of rest. And so I'm setting up our first one to come up in April. And we've identified a facilitator to kind of take over our staff meeting and work with us through some mindfulness activities. We're looking at how we can strategically engage some of our benefits, our employee wellness benefits during that time, and really just closing down our operation to support our staff in like resetting their expectations, calming nervous systems, talking about what went well, and then re-engaging the following week.
Oh, I was muted. Sorry. I think that that's a great idea, Raven, and I think that um, it really speaks to the fact that if we are planning a program, or we are writing a grant about a program, we always include the planning phase because we view that as work, but the debriefing or deloading phase, we don't ever include that in our frameworks of understanding how programming goes. So like the minute one thing stops, we're starting the next thing immediately, right? And that's not how humans are wired to work. And our culture, I think that we need to push back against some of that. And I think that by ingraining this in the actual programming rollout, Raven, is such a incredibly brilliant way of making sure that rest is prioritized just as much as work, and viewing that as like a natural part of the cycle and not something that can just be forgotten or thrown away at the slightest bit of inconvenience. So thank you for sharing that. That really blew my mind, and I'm really excited to hopefully hear from you in the future how that goes. Great. So those are the recaps that we've had so far. Are there any surprises on that list? I know that it seems like you all have been kind of engaging with all of these in your own particular way. Or are there any other things that maybe have come up for you in last year and you want to know, is it just me who is dealing with this, or is this something maybe industry wide? Happy to open up the floor for any of those questions. Hey, Adriana. You're muted.
4 years, still can't figure out when to mute and unmute. Um, Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I'm late, but I actually came at the perfect slide. I appreciate that so much. I think something else that I have been related to the post-pandemic, I mean, I don't know everyone in the room because we just probably did introductions. And so we are a BIPOC-led organization. And so something I'm noticing is I'm calling it like woke giving, right? Like there's a decrease like post 2020 and after the murder of George Floyd, we saw such like an abundance and over giving and just like our inbox like overflowing. And then now um we saw a huge decrease last year. So that's just something else. I don't know if you touched upon that too. It's definitely something that I identified with my team when I had to talk about our delta that we had last year. So I'm entering 2024 a little bitter because not only like on an individual giving, but I'm also noticing a shift with some major institutions, and I'm feeling I was hopeful is the word that I want to use in this shift. And now I'm feeling, I think I'm walking away a little bit used and tokenized over the past 3 years in terms of grant applications.
Yeah, 100%. I can tell you for a fact that you're not alone in that. The numbers support that. The anecdotal stories of being a fundraiser, knowing other fundraisers of color support that. Yeah, I think that there are a number of things that feed into that. I think uh philanthropy in that moment had a reckoning with itself about its inability um in the past to rectify its place in society and how it interacts with communities of color, especially Black communities, and especially Black-led organizations, especially around how they fund. And this is my personal opinion. I don't feel that's very atypical of how the response was from an individual basis. I think it was the micro and macro mirrored each other. We saw lots of funding and money and resources flow in for the first time, with the expectation that like this was going to be something that was a systemic change that organizations could rely upon to be able to build out infrastructure to help close some of that gap, right? And within 2 years, most, if not all of that money was gone. And I want to really uplift the fact that there's also um, a cultural component to this too. And like even just the reference that you made of like, what did you say? Woke, what was it?
Yeah, woke giving.
Yeah, woke giving, right? So I want us to think critically about how race issues post 2020 have been viewed in this country. Like whether you talk about even just the word woke and what it means in certain spaces versus like the original connotation of that term and what it was meant to mean. Whether you talk about DEI initiatives at schools or institutions literally being outlawed, critical race theory, which was the soup du jour like last year, you know what I mean? So there has been a cultural backlash to this that is also influencing um what we're seeing in philanthropy. And this is a phenomenon that exists not only when you look at issues of race, but for instance, gender, sexuality, organizations that are led by women, LGBTQ led organizations are facing backlash now that the social spotlight, I guess we would say, are on women's issues right now, as well as LGBTQ issues, especially trans-led organizations, are seeing a severe decrease both in regular donations from foundations, but also corporate sponsors as well. So it is unfortunate, but you're not alone in that. If there's any comfort in that. Anything else? Any other surprises, things that happened last year, um, that you want to know? Is this just us or how things are looking for other groups? And also want to open up the floor too for other orgs, especially Black and BIPOC led orgs, to talk about how fundraising has been for them over the past couple of years and what those trends have looked like. Hi, Emma, were you trying to speak?
Yeah,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Kelsey.
Coming maybe from the opposite perspective of like a white-led foundation that I worked at last year, something that I thought that was really interesting that kind of relates to the themes we've been talking about. We were meeting with an independent school and they were talking about how they don't even launch like a public facing campaign anymore because they just know that all of their money is going to come from a very small pool of like ultra wealthy individuals. And at the time I thought that was really interesting because it just like it mirrors so well how the rich are just getting richer and like that specific independent school was like, why would we waste any of our time or resources on targeting other people? And obviously that was something they were able to do because of their donor base, but it made me really sad because it's just like, like it reflects the macro trend of like the widening wealth gap to the point that fundraisers are like, why would we even target people below like a certain threshold? So it kind of relates to what we were talking about, but from the foundation perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emma. That is definitely something that organizations are going to have to grapple with. But what I would say is that's going to put that school at immense risk. So for instance, like if you were running a giving program and you're trying to raise $100,000, right? If two people give you $100,000 or 2,000 people give you $100,000, right? There is much more inherent risk, even though it's easier to get that $100,000 from those two people. Because if one of those people say no, that's 50% of your money gone. And now you're looking at a real budget gap and something to close, right? And because you literally do not solicit those folks, you're not building those relationships. You're not going to have many other places to turn to if and when that happens. Like we're all fundraisers. We know individual donors can be fickle sometimes, the same way philanthropy can be fickle sometimes. Or maybe it's just the end of a natural giving cycle for a funder across the board. So, you always want to appreciate the large gifts. They're critical. I would never say like don't go after big money, right? It makes our life easier. And we should try and get that. But we also have to know that like if you are 100% dependent on a very finite group to fund a majority of your work, you can put yourself in crisis very, very quickly. So that would be my one piece of advice around that. Oh, Raven, thank you for that link. I'm definitely gonna check that out. Surprise, I hope folks also click on that to talk about it's talking about the drop in giving to Black-led orgs post 2020. Great. So sorry for that depressing back look and potentially depressing forward look that we're about to have about my 2024 predictions, but I think that we're going to make it through. But we have to really understand what we're looking at as fundraisers and be able to like kind of see the lay of the land to know how to move and how to best position our organizations, right? No matter what, we're here for a higher purpose because we do work to help folks, and we're needed. So regardless of the environment that we are fundraising in, I think that it's important for us to have some optimism and operate with an abundance mindset. But let's look into that crystal ball for 2024. The first one, which while doing research for this, I found this to be very interesting, is that trust will continue to deteriorate in the public sector. So we are seeing across the board as a nation and as a society, uh, a a breakdown of trust in institution in and of itself, whether it is the government, corporations, the media, um, philanthropy. But you can see here, um, philanthropy dropped by the most. So there's still a high level of trust, but that the rate of it dropping is fast. There are a number of reasons for that. I think as people look across the board at the nonprofit space, we are the most misunderstood sector of employment. We are the third largest sector of employment, but folks really don't understand how they engage with the nonprofit sector, what working in one looks like, how money is distributed through there. And so it's highly susceptible that people look at nonprofits or at charities or however you want to frame your organization, and see people getting paid or making a living wage and viewing that as embezzlement or stealing or things of that nature. There have been some high profile cases of some organizations over the past couple of years that have had some interesting financial situations, which don't help the cause. But this is definitely something that I think, without proper public education about our work, what we do, and how we are trying to uplift and change the world, there's a potential for this to potentially continue. So that's one that I would like to highlight. Um, and then tied along with that is funder paralysis. So my prediction for 2024 is that foundations will continue to go through strategic redesigns as there is not a strong moral arc for our work currently. My reasoning around this is looking back 4 years ago, I think that there was a high level of mobilization around very specific issues that spurred, whether you want to call it the woke giving, mutual aid during the pandemic, increased giving from foundations, to address some of the most prevalent issues of our time that have popped up at the same time. And so a lot of that money has been pumped in. And I think that a lot of that optimism has waned, along with the burnout that we've seen of the folks actually doing the work in our organizations. There are some I guess I would say mixed results about what wins folks were able to accomplish over the past few years. And there's been a lack of investment that we've seen to carry out a lot of the initiatives that we saw um, from 2020 in through 2024. And what that has done has left us without the infrastructure investment for groups to do cross organizing, to be able to tell philanthropy what we need as well, or for philanthropy to be able to look at the lay of the land and figure out, okay, where are we going and how do we invest and tap in with groups. So I think everything is in this kind of wait and see period, and I've seen a ton of foundations who are now like, we need to figure out how we're adjusting to this new climate that we're in. Adriana says that yeah, it got sunsetted by a major fund foundation based on a strategic pivot. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I've been seeing that so much over the past year and into this year. And I think it would be helpful for everyone here to hear what that kind of sounds like.
Um, you who aren't aware of like Salted Roots, so we were formerly operating as Brown Girl Surf, and so we're based in California, and a lot of our work is focused on coastal and ocean access for girls, women, and gender expansive folks. And so they have been one of our major funders since the beginning, particularly around our advocacy work at the local and state level, which includes, like I said, coastal access, equitable beach permitting. And so they were huge supporters in different capacities, because they had like a marine and market equity cohort that we received funding. And so there were a lot of different things that they had funded that was really supporting the infrastructure and the growth of our organization since I joined in 2020. And then last year I heard from our lead, I think it had already been public. I know because they were doing like all the surveys that foundations do to like give input on their strategy if you want to give comments, because they hire someone from the outside, but they already know that the board is going to choose what the board wants to do. And so when the program officer presented me with the new strategy, it was very clear that we didn't fit any of it, because they were going very much moving towards on like a global scale in very specific areas. I was very happy to see like their what do I want to say, explicit language and support of Indigenous communities, which I think is super important. And it made me curious of like, how did they determine certain like areas in different parts of the world, considering that Packard is based out of California. So that was like interesting to me. And so at the time, she didn't want to say, no, we're not a fit, because there is, how foundations always just have those like random buckets that they can pull from, and the president has their own budget line that they could give grants to and such. So I am still waiting to hear from the program officer, because when I had this conversation, of course, being my role as ED, I was like, well, I want to talk about a transitional grant. I want to talk about a sunset grant, because we were talking about like moving from multi-year grants at 6 figures, and then all of a sudden to pull that plug was going to be a lot. And so we felt that this year, right, like we only have one funder at about $60,000 for our advocacy work. And, that had grown massively since 2020. And so I'm still trying to get a hold of that program officer for that sunset grant. But yeah, it's interesting, because they are a very wealthy foundation. And so it does make me yeah, like I said, like a little bitter. And I think that is like a natural part of the process, because they were really involved with our work and wanting to support us. And then it's hard not to feel like, a trend and of the moment, and right, like as they pivot. And so I think it goes back to like the trust, and like, what does it feel like to move from what you think is like a transformational relationship to just like transactional, to just being like cut off in that way. And I know you shouldn't be relying on those kinds of things. And I think, as this slide said, like the optimism of 2020, right? Like I was having some like I felt like some honest and genuine conversations with funders. And then to just kind of feel like dropped on the side definitely broke that sense of trust for me and how to like show up in other spaces with them to be supportive of them.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think that that's something that a lot of groups are going through. I ran my own organization and had a very similar thing happen to me where they went through a strategic redesign and we just weren't a fit anymore because they changed how they were looking at the type of work that they were doing, even though they were like our main funder and didn't really have too much heads up to be able to like pivot or figure out what to do next. So it's a difficult landscape out there, and foundations can and should be doing more because they have the resources to. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think we're gonna have to wait and see how that plays out. Speaking of wait and see, the national election, right? So predicting that organizations that are doing like get out the vote advocacy are gonna struggle to raise money. There's been like a real malaise that's set in over the election. You know, it's March, and like the mobilization really hasn't been there in the ways that I remember seeing it even during a pandemic or previous to that in 2016. Um, the get out the vote efforts, even for primary season, because one party didn't have primaries really, or adopt enough other candidates. Um, it hasn't been strong. And I feel like philanthropy is also in a wait and see period to figure out how to invest and what groups to invest in and how to frame that. A lot of the work also hasn't been around policy. So it's been very hard for organizations who do get out the vote work around specific policies to grasp that funding and that narrative. Um, and there have been recent events that are causing a real strong apathy coming from the left. We've seen that throughout um, this primary season, especially with things going on and the outlook in Michigan. And so I think organizations are starting to engage with election season a lot later because the picture is a lot less clear. And because we're behind the ball, organizations are going to struggle to make up that difference and also see the impact that they normally see through their work because we're just starting so much later in the game and with a less motivated populace just across the board with the choices that we have. Are there any folks who are doing get out the vote work traditionally who can speak to what they're seeing on the ground right now or what they're talking to funders about? Oh, no voter access groups in the house? Okay. We don't do that work directly. We do get out the vote work. We're investing a lot in advocacy work right now. Or see, was that like an intentional shift because of kind of what you're seeing, or was that like a deliberate program shift that, was already pre-planned?
I think it was already in the works. What I can speak to the fact that we're seeing a lot of like just saturation out in the field of GOTV type of work because we do a lot of work on college campuses
Mhm.
and there's like 5 other organizations tabling for GOTV on college campuses, So we identified like the issues that are most important to our base, which is like young people and college educated or college age folks. And so like we've adopted like gender and reproductive justice as one of our issue focus areas starting this year. I think it's just been in the works for a while, honestly.
Got you. That makes sense. Great. Thank you for sharing. Um, great. Now we are slowly running out of time. So I want to make sure that I get through all of these and then we can answer some questions that you may have. So another prediction is that mutual aid networks will expand as the fastest growing form of nonprofit organization. I think that we saw during the pandemic in the vacuum that government and philanthropy left, that mutual aid networks and organizations really filled that gap to provide direct aid to people in need. And I can foresee that potentially happening again post-election. So that might be something to just look out for. We have some questions about AI and philanthropy and how these two will interact. And my prediction is that that relationship will deepen very quickly, but will require an industry-wide reckoning with like what it actually means to work in this work, and also what does safety and privacy mean in this work. So I think, you know, we're going to see AI continue to be used to increase capacity on our teams. You know, I have an AI note taker now that takes notes so that I can focus on giving a training or having a conversation and don't have to stop and take notes. That greatly increases my capacity as a person, but we've seen AI start to be developed for actual like deliberate tasks. So deepening personalization and segmentation, being able to handle more robust donor outreach strategies. I've seen even, you know, sometimes when you go on a website and you have like the little pop-up that comes up with a robot and you can like get different tasks done on the side. I've seen nonprofits do that for folks to donate. So like the AI robot will manage the process of getting people to donate for them. And these increase efficiency, increase automation, but also can put a lot of development jobs at risk, especially entry-level jobs, people doing data management, people doing some of the behind-the-scenes structural work. I know we talked about before the pipeline kind of being jammed and a lot of lack of development directors, EDs being available. We're potentially going to see less people entering the field because there are going to be less jobs for that type of work. And so this will potentially increase as Gen Z becomes bigger and bigger fundraising targets, because older development staffs will rely on machine learning to connect with younger donors and to build in that base. There are going to be inherent data security and privacy risks as organizations use AI but want to keep information confidential. So for instance, donor information, AI is machine learning. It shares information to the internet and brings it back in to be able to do tasks. That is inherently at odds with structures around, you know, how we normally protect the donor privacy and things of that nature. So depending on how things are set up, there could be really big information that could leak out. So something to think about. Has anyone dabbled with AI in here yet, or have any thoughts about what that is going to look like for your work? Go for it, Adriana.
Well, I want to be mindful if there's other people that want to share first. No, maybe not. Okay.
Good.
Um, so the only capacity that I've used it in, so just for context is we're a team of 11, so a lot of our staffing is program, and so I'm the only fundraiser, and so we have a part-time grant writer. And so like a lot of organizations, a lot of grant writing or just like finishing off grant applications sit with me. And so I was in a pinch working on multiple things. And so I used ChatGPT to help me, because we all know how grant applications is like, answer this question in 500 characters or 500 words. And so I asked our ChatGPT friend to be like, can you trim this in like by 300 characters, like whatever I've needed. And so instead of having to do that like dance where you're like, change this, change that, like back and forth. And so that actually really helped me. So that I can continue to like just get that done, submit it, and like move on to the next thing. So that's the only capacity that I've used it in. Um, and like other administrative ways of just like write like a shared van policy. And I was showing my administrative coordinator of like, hey, you need some like general template language. That has helped. And then we can always modify it to what our organization and tailor it personally. And so just thinking about like efficiency in that way. But that's been my only experience with AI.
100%. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that that is something that a lot of people are starting to use it for. Michelle says like drafting appeals and award nominations. Yeah, to grab tone and things of that nature. Again, not definitely not saying that I've never used it. Definitely not saying that like there is no utility in it. Even from like just a starting place to have something to refer to do some of your writing. But again, like there are different forms of, where this can go. And I think that we are at, the baby steps stage, right? I think as the machine learns more, and as we learn to use it more, like I didn't even know you could train Chat GPT, which is something I learned just now. So, as these things develop, they're going to develop rapidly. So by the time we check in again next year, Chat GPT could probably write an entire grant for you, right? So, but what does that do for the job of a grant writer? You know what I mean? So there are these things that we're going to have to figure out as an industry as we begin to engage with this. And our work is not immune from the robots. Great. Next prediction, digital fundraising is the present. It's the now. I am predicting that this year will be the year that digital fundraising becomes a third of all fundraising. The pandemic has really, really accelerated that. And so I think we are now living in a really heavily digitally adopted age. And so we're going to see trends that have been going on so far continue. So right now we're at 12% of all giving. And just a couple years ago, 2019 pre-pandemic, we were under 9%. So it's growing pretty rapidly. But with the election and post-election mobilization that's going to happen, I think that there are great ways for and avenues for digital fundraising to increase. And Catherine just dropped some gems in the chat if you are trying to learn how to train Chat GPT. So definitely follow that. And Meek has a AI grant writing course. Yeah, I also am predicting that social media and gaming/streaming will be some of the fastest growing fundraising channels for organizations. Gen Z is growing in its own as a fundraising base for folks. And so organizations will have to meet them where they are and how they organize online, which are often on social media or in gaming and streaming platforms. We've seen this grow and develop pretty rapidly. One of the organizations that I've worked with in the past literally just did a streaming fundraiser a couple weeks ago that brought in over $400,000 in 3 days from a streaming marathon. So there's a lot of growth and potential in that space. And I think that that will continue. Hey, Catherine, see your hand.
Thanks, I feel like yeah, I have never heard of that, like a gaming fundraiser. That sounds really interesting. Can you share more about, yeah, what that looks like?
Yeah, for sure. So I assume everyone here is familiar with with video games, but a very recent phenomenon is people watching other people play video games. So instead of them playing themselves, they will watch their favorite. If you've heard of young people talk about streamers, there are people who do a live stream. So you watch them play the video game. They have personalities and talk online. And so there are platforms like YouTube, but Twitch is the most popular gaming platform. And so sometimes, and this is people's professional jobs as well. Like some people stream for a living and make very good money doing it. And a lot of popular streamers now will do streams for charity. So they will say, I'm going to play Super Mario and try and do a speed run and beat this game in 3 hours. And if I do that, like I need people to come in the chat and donate. So like people will donate on behalf and they'll give it away to a charity. So some of the orgs I work with raise like 6-figure donations only in the streaming space alone. Um, Again, it's a great way to connect with younger bases, and it allows them to like interact directly with causes that they believe in. So it's a bigger thing for like Gen Z and millennials. Maura, yes.
Yeah. So in our team, we've actually talked about the Twitch possibility. And the question that we always ran into is the way that you do this, is it like you set up your own account and put in like staff hours to developing a Twitch following in order to people, because if you don't have a following, it's like you're screaming into a void. So, or is it that you go and contact streamers and influencers and people who already have a following and ask for this? Like, what's the best strategy to go about this?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So I would say you need to look at it almost like a major giving program. So you're going to recruit people or like a peer-to-peer giving program. You're going to recruit people to fundraise for you. It's not that like, Progressive Multiplier Fund would have its own Twitch account and I'd be sitting there playing video games all day. Although I wish I could do that. That'd probably be pretty fun. But what they would do is I would partner with I would reach out to someone who is a streamer and say I'm from XYZ organization, love your work, would love for you to potentially do a charity stream for my organization. This is a little bit about what we do, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are multiple ways of engaging with folks, but that's what you would do. You wouldn't necessarily host it yourself. Um, a little bit more on digital fundraising. My prediction is digital and in-person giving will continue to blend and blur. QR codes are here to stay. It's very rare you see a paper menu anymore anywhere, I think that's now like an adopted form of life, and so digital wallets are here to stay. And so we'll see digital forms of giving be integrated into real life events. So you will go to a gala or a fundraiser and there will be a QR code for you to scan on your phone to be able to donate, rather than the old school way of they'll have the card on the table and you can write your check or accept cash. Like that is potentially out the door. There'll be card readers at events, so that people can just tap their phone and do Apple Pay to be able to do transactions, things of that nature. And what that means for us too is that the way that we count money and break down where money is coming from is going to blur as well, because you're going to have mobile giving that was done at an in-person event, et cetera, et cetera. So that integration is going to really blend everything together for it to be just individual giving. And then the last subject that I want to try and get through is that revenue diversification is the future. So a lot of the things that we talked about before and some of the warning signs that we're seeing around fundraising can be solved through revenue diversification. And I think that organizations are going to have to pursue different forms of rev gen to combat the slowing giving trends. I think that we're seeing a real shift in how we do our work. I don't think you can ignore a 3-year period of like decline in the traditional means of giving while other forms are growing, right? And so more organizations are going to need to recognize sooner than later that they have to adopt different forms of connecting with younger people, with different people, to be able to fundraise through them. And the quicker that you're able to do that, the better you'll be at it and the better your organization will be at it. And another one is that regardless of what happens with the election, organizations will move to meet potential donors where they are and give them different ways of getting involved. So one thing that I think that will happen is, you know, even though giving is trending downward, thinking of how do we resource our movement? How do we resource our work in different ways? So instead of just financial gifts, is there volunteer efforts that folks can do? Are there in-kind donations that people can provide? Really starting to think deeply about how folks can engage with the work and build community outside of just fundraising. Great. Would love to, in the last couple minutes we have, hear what some of your predictions are, and if you agree, disagree with any of mine, or are thinking anything different.
Hello. Hi, I'm Wendy. I'm from a nonprofit theater company, so I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here. But I resonate with a lot of what you're saying about fundraising challenges. I'm recent in my development position too, and having looked like through past asks to institutions and corporations, what I've picked up the most is it's like the narrative is changing in the ask, that they're really funding organizations are really interested in impact reports. It's like we've done served this many people, built this many homes, done this, and so and we haven't included those in our conversation or our narrative before, and they're really interested in transparency. Just on a sort of an optimistic note, we're kind of coming at this as like we're holding our heads high as nonprofits because, like you said, we're a third of the workforce, but we're also solving a problem for them because there are social corporate responsibility sort of quotas that almost all corporations have now. And so if we come in, heads held high and saying, look, this is you want to serve people in this way, and we can do that for you, and this is how. And so yeah, just real like tooling up on how we ask is like the way forward, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendy. And you're 100% right on both notes. I think we've seen an increase towards what people are deeming like data-driven choices around grants. And a lot of that is coming from the top, so from boards who want to understand why decisions are being made. And so that trickle-down effect is why a lot of grant applications look the way that they are now. And there's less focus on narrative and storytelling and more focus on, well, what are you quote unquote doing, right? And so, for instance, to the earlier conversation about explaining the chrysalis year, that's why I wanted to ask like how you would go about doing that, because it like maybe 5-10 years ago, that's a lot easier to explain in a grant application than it is today. And so it was intriguing to me to hear how that was being brought up. And yeah, you're 100% right. I think that oftentimes we get in this place of not feeling like feeling this impending scarcity around our work, right? But ultimately, these organizations need us, and the people need us, right? So we are the conduit for which a lot of work happens, and that walking into these conversations and into these spaces, knowing that like we are supposed to be here and we need to do the work and we do good work is a great way to think about that. And I appreciate the optimism. I know this wasn't the most the most uplifting presentation, but I appreciate that.
But just one more last thought is so just from coming from the theater world and arts organizations, you know, the pivot that we've heard is that foundations are going more towards social justice and poverty and away from arts. So that's sort of been our conversation. And so we've been going like, oh darn, you know, we're falling out of vogue or whatever. But you know, this conference or this conversation has been very insightful for me personally, just to see like, yeah, you guys are really need it. Like you need, yeah, you know, we need to support our, you know, social justice and all of those organizations. So it's given me a lot of perspective.
Sure, thank you for that. I'm glad it has, and you know that's very natural. What philanthropy tends to focus on is what are the mass issues or focuses of the day. So that shift goes back and forth, and can go back and forth also within different focus areas. So if you're talking more social justice organizations, there will be a pivot to maybe one type of work, whether it might be like racial equity work, and then it might be women's rights, and then it might be civil rights, and then voter access, right? And so that spotlight keeps moving. And then also, I think in the arts world, it does as well, right? So whether it's a focus on maybe music or music access for children or fine arts or, digital arts, I think that we just have to be aware of like everything that's going on around us, and be sure that, we're able to be sustained maybe during the times that the spotlight aren't on us, to be able to make it through to the next time that it is. But wanted to thank you all so much for taking part in the conversation today. Please check out the bit.ly/fundraising-Friday, and hope to see you all in the next session. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kafile. Bye, everybody.